It was dawn on March 1st, 1943. In Port Moresby, the tropical rain turned the coral runway into a sticky mud, but Major Ed Larner barely felt the water running down his uniform. At 31 years old, with 72 combat missions etched on his weary face, he watched his crews prepare for what High Command had already classified as impossible. Allied intelligence had intercepted terrifying communications. A massive Japanese Imperial Armada had sailed from Rabaul under cover of darkness. It consisted of 8 heavy transport ships and 8 escort destroyers tearing through the Bismarck Sea. The cargo, nearly 7,000 elite soldiers, fresh and armed to the teeth, destined to reinforce the garrison at Leh. Larner knew exactly what those numbers meant. If that fleet reached its destination, it would mean 7,000 more enemies entrenched in the dense jungle of New Guinea. It meant months of hand-to-hand combat, malaria, and thousands of condolence letters being sent home. Stopping that train wasn't just a mission, it was a desperate necessity. But there was a problem that plagued Larner. A problem not of courage, but of geometry and physics. For 8 months, the 5th Air Force had been trying to destroy Japanese convoys by the book, precision bombing from 3,000 meters high. On paper, it worked. In practice, it was a humiliating failure. The math was brutal. A 500-kilogram bomb dropped from that altitude took exactly 37 seconds to reach the ocean surface. Those were 37 long seconds of freefall. For an experienced Japanese captain, this was an eternity. They watched the skies, saw the bomb bay doors open, and with a simple command to the helm, the ship would turn. As the bomb fell, a destroyer traveling at 30 knots covered almost 350 meters, the length of 3 football fields. The result was always the same. The American pilots watched helplessly from above as their bombs exploded spectacularly in the empty water, creating harmless geysers where the ship had been half a minute before. The success rate was a meager 3%. However, the cost to the Allies was brutal. While the bombers tried to align their sights high above, they became easy targets. The methodical and precise Japanese anti-aircraft artillery filled the sky with black clouds of flak. Larner's squadron was bleeding. They had lost 4 aircraft and 40 men in the last month alone, sacrificed in the name of a tactic that simply didn't work. Desperation demanded innovation. It was then that General George Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, put a proposal on the table that made the veterans pale. It seemed like something out of a feverish delirium. "Forget about altitude," he ordered. "I want you to descend. I want you to fly 15 meters above the water." The room fell silent. 15 meters. The height of a 4-story building. The idea was to take advantage of inertia, launch the bomb at high speed, not so that it would sink, but so that it would ricochet off the surface of the water like a flat stone thrown into a lake, leaping over the waves until it violently struck the side of the enemy ship. Armchair theorists said it was physically possible. Pilots called it suicide. Flying a heavy, slow, twin-engine B-25 Mitchell bomber at that altitude meant voluntarily entering the lethal range of every weapon the enemy possessed. A Japanese destroyer was a steel hedgehog, bristling with 127mm main guns and dozens of 25mm automatic cannons. At 15 meters, a pilot couldn't afford to make a mistake. A single engine failure, and the plane would do a deadly pirouette into the sea before the crew could even scream. The High Command had already banned this tactic twice, classifying it as a reckless waste of aircraft and personnel. But on that rainy March morning, with 7,000 enemies closing in on the coast, safety rules were thrown out the window. Larner looked at his men. They weren't going to bomb. They were going to a point-blank knife fight. To make this madness feasible, the B-25 Mitchell couldn't remain the same aircraft that rolled off the North American Aviation assembly line. It had to be transformed. Originally, this bomber had been designed as a precision medium-altitude instrument, delivering its payload with the aid of complex optical sights and wind calculations. But Larner and the engineers of the 5th Air Force knew that 15 meters above the sea surface, flying against a wall of steel, those sights were dead weight. They didn't need delicate instruments, they needed teeth. A radical and hasty surgery then began in the field workshops. The mechanics ripped the bombardier's position from the glazed nose, the seat where traditionally the mathematics of freefall were calculated, and replaced it by sheer brute force. They installed 4 fixed 50 caliber heavy machine guns in the nose and bolted 4 more into blisters, cupolas, on the sides of the fuselage. This modification altered the aircraft's center of gravity, adding over 500 kilograms to the nose, but the result was terrifying. Suddenly, the B-25 ceased to be a mere explosives transport vehicle. It became a flying artillery platform capable of spitting 200 high-caliber bullets per second in its flight path. Larner's theory was total suppression by fire. He knew that a twin-engine bomber, heavy and lacking the agility of a fighter, was an easy target on a straight, level approach. The only way to survive the last 1,000 meters against a destroyer was to turn the enemy ship's deck into a hell before the bomb was even dropped. The idea was psychologically brutal, to force the Japanese gunners to choose between firing back or throwing themselves to the ground to avoid being torn to pieces. But theory without practice is just a quick way to die. The drills were conducted in absolute secrecy, bordering on paranoia. General Kenny found the perfect target, the Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamship that had run aground on a reef near Port Moresby in 1924. The rusty wreck, half submerged in the turquoise waters, became the most dangerous classroom in the Pacific. Larner's crews flew at dawn and dusk, when the light was dim and observers were few. They had to learn to overcome the instinctive fear of seeing the horizon disappear and be replaced by waves passing at 430 km/h, so close that the sea spray salted the windshield. They had to learn to time the launch to the millisecond, and most importantly, they learned what happened when they failed. On February 16th, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett made a miscalculation that served as a warning to everyone. He flew too high, about 20 meters. The bomb hit the water, bounced twice, passed completely over the wreck's superstructure, and exploded harmlessly 300 meters away in the open sea. Fawcett's bombardier, Sergeant Russo, immediately recalibrated. Lower, faster. On the next pass, Fawcett skimmed the water at only 13 meters. The bomb ricocheted once and smashed against the hull of the Pruth, right at the waterline. If that wreck had been a destroyer loaded with ammunition, it would have been the end. But the Pruth had an advantage over the real enemy. It didn't fire back. Now, back in the operations tent under the March rain, the drills were over. Larner spread the recent reconnaissance photographs out on the planning table. The Japanese train had been sighted at dawn and was only 90 minutes away. He pointed to the train's flagship, a 10,000-ton, 240-meter-long monster. That was the primary target. The mathematics of skip bombing now demanded perfect execution under live fire. Larner reviewed the vital numbers, etching them into the minds of each pilot. Approach altitude, 4 meters. No more, no less. Speed, 430 km/h. Starting point, 270 meters from the target. Delay fuse, 5 seconds. Failure in any of these variables meant absolute disaster. If the fuse was too short, the explosion would bring down the very plane that launched it. If the altitude was wrong, the bomb would sink or bounce off the target. Larner assigned the targets, a specific ship for each pilot. Transports as a priority, destroyers as secondary targets if the transports were already burning. No one would attack the same ship twice. The order was maximum efficiency and total destruction on the first pass. At 7 a.m., 54 men walked silently to their 9 modified B-25s. The air was heavy, laden with the smell of high-octane fuel and the dampness of the jungle. Behind them, Australian fighters were already warming up their engines for the escort. Larner climbed into the cockpit and started the engines. The roar of the Wright cyclones filled the coral runway, muffling the sound of the rain. They were going to fly into the mouth of hell, and the only guarantee they had was the skill of their own hands and the thin aluminum armor that separated them from eternity. Visual contact was made at 0852. On the gray horizon, plumes of black smoke appeared, the diesel exhaust of 16 warships sailing in close formation. Larner pressed the throat microphone button once. A dry click. It was the attack signal. Silence was maintained on the radio. Surprise was the only advantage they possessed, and they couldn't afford to waste it. At 0857, the trap closed with surgical precision. The first act fell to the Australians. 13 Beaufighter heavy fighters swooped down on the convoy like falcons, sweeping the decks of the destroyers with their 20mm cannons. The objective was not to sink the ships, but to blind them, to force the Japanese gunners to lower their heads. 30 seconds later, the B-17 bombers, flying high above the clouds, dropped their charges. The bombs fell far away, but they served their purpose: panic. The Japanese ships broke formation, veering violently to starboard and port to avoid the explosions, destroying their organized defensive line. It was the chaos Larner had expected. He pushed the throttle and his B-25 plunged to 15 meters. The speed stabilized at 430 km/h. The sea turned into a gray blur beneath the fuselage. Ahead of him, a troop transport ship loomed large in the windshield, filling his entire field of vision. A destroyer on the left wing spotted them. The sky filled with flashes and tracers, but the first salvos exploded too high. The Japanese gunners, conditioned by years of war to fight aircraft in the sky, couldn't lower their sights quickly enough to hit a target flying at mast height. At 1,800 meters, Larner opened fire. The 8 nose-mounted machine guns roared in unison. The effect was devastating. Windows on the bridge shattered, metal twisted, and men on deck were mowed down like wheat. The suppression worked. No one could fire back against a hail of 800 bullets per minute. 300 meters, shouted the bomber. Bomb loaded. Larner released the payload. The plane lurched upward as it shed the 450 kilograms. The bomb hit the water, bounced once with macabre elegance, and flew straight into the ship's hull, piercing the steel just above the waterline. Larner pulled hard on the control stick, climbing desperately to escape his own destruction. The 5-second fuse had expired. He didn't see the explosion, but he felt it. The shockwave hit the tail of the B-25 like a physical punch, throwing the bomber sideways. Behind him, the transport broke in two. Ammunition and fuel detonated in the holds, creating a column of fire that rose hundreds of meters. The tactic worked. To his right, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett was leaving another transport engulfed in flames. To his left, Captain Bill Hayes dropped his bomb on a destroyer. The explosive ricocheted twice and struck the stern. The internal explosion was so violent that the rear third of the warship was simply torn off, sinking the vessel in seconds. In just 90 seconds, 4 ships were destroyed. The impossible was happening before their eyes. But the enemy learned quickly, and the euphoria was short-lived. A destroyer on the opposite flank managed to rotate its main turrets. Lieutenant Tom Mitchell was in its sights. The first shot missed by 50 meters, the second by 20, the third hit squarely. Mitchell's B-25 didn't crash, it disintegrated. The bomb it carried under the fuselage detonated on impact with the enemy projectile. There were no parachutes, no radios, no survivors. 5 men were vaporized in a fraction of a second, transformed into a cloud of debris and black smoke that mingled with the sea spray. Larner saw the explosion out of the corner of his eye, but there was no time for mourning. The attack continued. The sea was boiling, the sky was filled with metal, and they still had bombs to deliver. At 09:15, the battle changed dramatically. The sky, until then dominated by bombers, suddenly filled with agile, silvery shapes. 18 Japanese Zero fighters plunged from the clouds, falling upon Larner's scattered formation like birds of prey. The B-25s were vulnerable. They were flying low, with empty fuel tanks and nearly dry ammunition magazines. Suddenly, the hunters became prey. The aerial combat descended to wave level, transforming into a claustrophobic struggle where sea and sky blurred together. Lieutenant Paul Warren, whose bomber was already bleeding fuel from a punctured wing, desperately tried to maneuver his wounded giant. But an experienced Japanese pilot clung to its tail, patient and lethal. A short burst from a 20mm cannon was enough. Warren's right engine exploded. The B-25 yawed violently and smashed into the water at 300 km/h. Only 3 parachutes deployed before impact. The ocean swallowed the entire fuselage in seconds. Larner, his windshield splattered with oil and salt water, fought for his life, zigzagging between the crests of the waves as tracers passed inches from his cockpit. Salvation came from above. Heavy B-17 bombers returned for a second high-altitude pass, forcing the Zeros to climb to protect what remained of the airship. It was the gap that allowed Larner and the survivors to escape home. But the Bismarck Sea had not yet finished exacting its price in blood. When the smoke finally cleared, the tally of destruction was staggering. Of the 16 warships and transport ships that had left Rabaul with the arrogance of certain victory, were at the bottom of the sea. What followed over the next 3 days was a chapter that many history books prefer to ignore. It was the transition from tactical battle to systematic extermination. The Allied High Command issued a ruthless order. No reinforcements should reach the beach. PT patrol boats and bombers returned to the area, not to engage ships, but to hunt lifeboats and floating debris. The distinction between combat and massacre disappeared. Of the 7,000 elite soldiers sent to reinforce New Guinea, fewer than 900 would reach the coast alive, and most unarmed, sick, and unfit for war. The backbone of Japanese logistics had been broken, but the sea had been stained red. War, however, is a living organism. It adapts to trauma. The Japanese learned the lesson of the Bismarck Sea the hard way. 3 months later, when they tried to send another train, the trap no longer worked the same way. The new Japanese destroyers came equipped with extra guns welded to the bulwarks, specifically pointed downwards towards the waterline. The gunners were trained to ignore the fear of suppression and fire directly into the final kill zone, where the bombardier could no longer maneuver. The American response was brute force. If the enemy had more weapons, the B-25s needed more armor and more firepower. Mechanics from the 5th Air Force bolted additional steel plates around the cockpits and added even more machine guns. Some B-25s even flew with 14 machine guns pointed forward. The logic became grim and absolute. It was no longer possible to avoid enemy fire, so the only way out was to kill all the gunners on deck before they could pull the trigger. The skip bombing tactic proved to be statistically 15 times more effective than high-altitude bombing, but it had evolved into a grotesque arms race where technology desperately tried to keep up with the carnage. Major Ed Larner survived the carnage he helped orchestrate. He flew 16 more combat missions before being recalled to the United States in June 1943. But the man who landed on American soil was no longer the same man who had left. The Army Air Corps had grand plans for him. They wanted to turn him into an elite instructor. The mission was simple: teach the next generation of young pilots how to execute skip bombing. They wanted him to pass on the technique that had sunk a fleet. But Larner did something unexpected. He refused. He knew the tactic worked, yes, but he also knew the cost. He had seen the faces of friends who disappeared in balls of fire 15 meters from the water. He didn't want to be the man who would sign the death warrant of more 20-year-old boys, teaching them to fly into steel walls. Larner requested an immediate transfer to the transport division. He went from being the tip of the spear to becoming a truck driver of the skies. He spent the rest of the war piloting slow, heavy, unarmed C-47 cargo planes, moving crates of supplies across the Pacific. No combat, no glory, no more deaths on his hands. He never explained the decision to his superiors, and the command, perhaps realizing the weight he carried, never asked. In December 1943, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. He refused the promotion twice before accepting it. He didn't want recognition. He just wanted the war to end so he could go home. Ed Larner died in Sacramento, California in 1997. He was 85 years old. His obituary in the local newspaper summarized his military service in a single generic sentence. There was no mention of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Nothing about the 8 ships destroyed in 15 minutes. Nothing about developing the tactic that strangled the Japanese Empire. He had asked his family not to discuss the matter. He took his ghosts and his glory to the grave in silence. General George Kenney received the credit in the history books for the brilliant idea. Larner was only credited with the execution. But for the pilots who flew that March morning, the distinction didn't matter. They knew who had led the attack. Today, museums like the Smithsonian display the B-25 Mitchell as an aviation legend, polished and restored. But none of the planes that flew in the Bismarck Sea survived to become museum pieces. They were consumed by the war or scrapped. The battle itself is often forgotten, overshadowed by more famous names like Midway or Guadalcanal. There are no Hollywood films about Larner. What remains is the stark truth. In March 1943, a group of desperate men proved it was possible to sink ships by ricocheting bombs in the water. Before they proved it worked, they called it suicide. Afterward, they called it genius. The truth lay somewhere in between. It was innovation born of desperation. It was courage measured in the decision to hold course while the air became lethal. If this story of sacrifice and ingenuity touched you, do me a favor. Click the like button. This helps YouTube show this story to more people, ensuring that men like Ed Larner don't disappear into the silence of the archives. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We are rescuing history, one day at a time. Thank you for watching, and until next time.